Carrying Plantagenet blood that was purer than the House of Tudor was the death sentence hanging over Lord Henry Pole. Henry VIII, forever insecure about the legitimacy of his own crown, saw his cousin's existence as a silent, constant insult. This execution was nothing more than a carefully disguised purge, the king seizing a chaotic moment to eliminate the one man who could threaten his throne. But the tragedy didn't end with the axe. The real horror was how the king destroyed the humanity of those left behind. He tortured Geoffrey Pole into madness to force a betrayal against his own brother, and ruthlessly left Pole's innocent young son to rot in a cold cell. From the grown man to the helpless child, Henry VIII used his power to suffocate an entire lineage out of existence. For over 3 centuries, the Plantagenet dynasty defined England, building its castles and laws before tearing itself apart in the Wars of the Roses. This brutal civil war saw the House of Lancaster and the House of York decimate the aristocracy, pitting cousin against cousin in a bloody struggle for power. The conflict culminated at Bosworth Field in 1485, where Richard III fell, and Henry Tudor seized the crown by conquest rather than birthright. Henry VII faced a precarious reign, knowing his claim to the throne was weak and that the wealthy North remained loyal to the fallen House of York. To secure his position, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses into the Tudor rose, a masterstroke of propaganda intended to heal the nation. While this union gave their children legitimacy, it could not entirely erase the old dynastic lines or the threat they posed. Despite the marriage, survivors of the House of York remained living under the suspicious gaze of a paranoid Tudor regime that viewed them as existential threats. As long as legitimate Plantagenet heirs existed, the Tudors feared the people might rally behind a white rose figurehead to replace their upstart dynasty. This is the dangerous world our protagonist enters, born into an era where his genetic code was considered a weapon of war. Henry Pole was born around 1492, right in the fragile, nervous early years of this new Tudor dynasty. To understand his position, we must look at his parents, for they represented the strange hybrid nature of the New England. His father was Sir Richard Pole. Sir Richard was a nobody in the grand scheme of royal genealogy. He was a Welsh knight, a solidly loyal supporter of Henry Tudor, and a man of moderate breeding. He was safe. He was the king's man, through and through. But his mother was royalty itself. She was Margaret Pole, and her maiden name was Plantagenet. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence. If you are familiar with Shakespeare or the history of the Wars of the Roses, the Duke of Clarence is the unfortunate, fickle man supposedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine on the orders of his own brother, Edward IV. George had been a brother to 2 kings, Edward IV and Richard III. This meant that Margaret Pole was a direct, legitimate granddaughter of the Yorkist line. She was the niece of 2 kings. She carried the old blood, the pure, undiluted royal blood that the Tudors desperately needed to co-opt, but also frantically needed to suppress. When Henry VII married Margaret to Sir Richard Pole, it was a calculated act of neutralization. It was a common political tactic of the time. Take a woman with a dangerous claim to the throne and marry her to a man of lower status. The logic was that her status would be lowered to his and her children would be half commoners, lacking the prestige to challenge the crown. Henry VII hoped that by marrying the royal princess to a safe, lower-ranking knight, she and her potential brood would fade into obscurity, becoming nothing more than country gentry. But biology does not always follow political strategy, and blood, as the Tudors would learn, is thicker than policy. Margaret Pole was a formidable woman. She had survived the destruction of her family. She had seen her father executed. She had seen her young brother Edward, Earl of Warwick, locked in the Tower of London for simply existing, only to be executed by Henry VII in 1499 to clear the way for the Tudor succession. She had learned the most important lesson of the age: silence is survival. She navigated the deep suspicion of Henry VII with a stoic grace, and despite the king's hopes that she would fade away, she produced sons. Her eldest son was Henry Pole. From the moment Henry Pole drew his first breath, he was a paradox. By virtue of his father, he was a simple gentleman, but by virtue of his mother, he had a genealogical chart that many old-school nobles, the conservative families who remembered the days before the Tudors, considered superior to that of the king himself. He was a living representative of the alternative. So, Henry Pole was born into a gilded cage. He was royalty, but he must never act like it. He was a cousin to the throne, but he must never look at it. His entire existence was a test of loyalty that he could never truly pass, because the test wasn't about what he did, but who he was. Despite the dangerous blood in his veins, Henry Pole's early life wasn't spent in a dungeon. It was spent in the sunlit center of the English Renaissance. The Tudors, for all their paranoia, preferred to keep their enemies close and well-fed. In 1509, the old miserly Henry VII died. The atmosphere in England changed overnight. His 18-year-old son ascended the throne as Henry VIII. This was a moment of national euphoria. The old king had been dark, suspicious, and obsessed with hoarding gold. The new king was golden, athletic, generous, and seemingly secure in his power. He was the Renaissance prince personified. Young King Henry VIII felt safe. He was young, he was loved, and he had a treasury full of his father's gold. He felt secure enough to embrace his mother's Yorkist kin rather than persecute them. He looked at the Pole family not as threats, but as cousins. He wanted to surround himself with a court that reflected his own glory, and that meant rehabilitating the old nobility. Henry Pole, just a year or so younger than the king, found himself swept up into the inner circle of young noblemen surrounding the monarch. He became one of the minions, the jousting partners, the hunting companions, the late-night gamblers who populated the king's privy chamber. It is difficult to reconcile the later image of Henry VIII, the bloated tyrant, with the young man Henry Pole knew. In those early years, the court was a place of endless pageantry. Imagine the scene. Young men, barely out of their teens, dressed in cloth of gold and Italian silks, riding through the lush English countryside, convinced they were bringing back the age of Camelot. Henry Pole was right there beside the king. They shared tutors. They shared jokes. There was a genuine affection there, the camaraderie of young men with the world at their feet. For the first 20 years of Henry VIII's reign, Henry Pole's life was a model of aristocratic success. The king fully rehabilitated the family. Pole's mother, Margaret, was restored to her rightful inheritance. In a grand gesture of reconciliation, Henry VIII made her the Countess of Salisbury in her own right, restoring the lands that had been stripped from her father. She became one of the wealthiest landowners in England, fifth only to the greatest dukes. Henry Pole himself was eager, desperate even, to prove that his Yorkist blood meant loyalty, not treason. He knew the shadow he lived under. He knew that the older members of the court whispered about his lineage, so he strove to be the perfect subject. In 1513, when Henry VIII launched a glorious, if incredibly expensive, and strategically dubious invasion of France, Henry Pole rode with him. He didn't just attend, he fought. On the battlefields of France, amidst the mud, the smoke of early cannons, and the clash of steel, Henry Pole proved his worth. He led men into combat for his Tudor cousin. The king rewarded this loyalty. On that campaign, Henry VIII knighted his cousin. He became Sir Henry Pole. A year later, the king elevated him to the peerage. He was created Baron Montagu. It was a revival of an ancient title held by his ancestors. He was given lands. He was appointed to positions of trust in the southern counties, justice of the peace, responsible for maintaining the king's law, collecting taxes, and keeping the peace. By his mid-30s, Lord Montagu had everything a nobleman could want. He had a wife, Jane Neville, from another powerful aristocratic family, further cementing his ties to the ruling class. He had a son, a bright young boy, also named Henry, ensuring the succession of his house. He had wealth, status, and the closeness of the king. He was doing everything right. He was quiet. He was dutiful. He didn't seek high political office like the ambitious butcher's son, Thomas Wolsey, or the lawyer, Thomas Cromwell. He seemed content to be a wealthy country magnate and a loyal cousin. He was trying so very hard to be boring. He avoided the factions. He avoided the theological debates that were beginning to simmer in Germany with a monk named Martin Luther. He focused on his estates, his hunting, and his service to the king. He was crafting a life of impeccable, unassailable loyalty. But for a Plantagenet, even being boring was dangerous. The golden age of the early Tudor reign was a mirage, shimmering over a landscape of deep insecurity. And as the 1520s drew to a close, the sky began to darken. The king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had been a second mother to Henry Pole and a best friend to his mother Margaret, was failing. There was no male heir. The king's great matter was approaching, and it would demand that everyone in England choose a side. For Henry Pole, this was the nightmare scenario. To choose the king was to betray his conscience and his mother. To choose his conscience was to betray the king and risk the axe. The tightrope was about to snap. As the 1520s bled into the 1530s, the sunlit days of the English Renaissance began to gray. The laughter of the jousting lists faded, replaced by the hushed, anxious whispers of a court under siege from within. Henry Pole stood at the precipice of this new era, watching his royal cousin transform from a golden prince into a brittle autocrat. The bonds of childhood friendship and shared blood, once Lord Montagu's greatest assets, were curdling into liabilities. The king was no longer looking for companions. He was looking for accomplices in his war against history and the church. For Henry Pole, the days of easy loyalty were over. The era of impossible choices had begun. The tragedy of Henry Pole did not begin with a sword or an arrest warrant. It began with a whisper in the king's ear, a rustle of silk in a corridor, and a passage in the book of Leviticus. By the late 1520s, the sunlit camaraderie of Henry VIII's early reign was being eclipsed by a singular, suffocating obsession: the king's great matter. Henry VIII, convinced that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was cursed by God because she had been his brother's widow, sought an annulment. He wanted a new wife, Anne Boleyn, and a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor line. For the average courtier, this was a political crisis. For Henry Pole, Lord Montagu, it was a personal catastrophe that tore the very fabric of his existence apart. To understand the depth of this crisis for the Pole family, we must remember who they were. They were not just noblemen, they were the bedrock of the old pious aristocracy. They were staunch Catholics who believed the authority of the Pope was absolute. More importantly, they were intimately bound to Queen Catherine. Henry Pole's mother, Margaret, was not merely a servant to the Queen, she was her dearest friend. Margaret had been the governess to the king and queen's daughter, the Princess Mary. She had practically raised the girl. The Poles and the Aragonese faction were intertwined by decades of shared faith, shared meals, and shared loyalty. Now the king, the cousin Henry Pole had ridden with, fought for, and loved, was demanding that he repudiate everything he believed in. He was asking the nobility of England to declare that the queen was a whore, the princess was a bastard, and the pope was a usurper. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. The reaction of the Pole family to the great matter reveals the desperate division of labor required to survive under a tyrant. Margaret Pole, the matriarch, chose the path of defiance. When the king banished Catherine of Aragon from court and stripped Princess Mary of her title, Margaret refused to abandon the girl. She offered to serve Mary at her own expense, even when the king furiously ordered the household dissolved. Margaret was a Plantagenet princess. She had seen kings fall before, and she possessed a stubborn, ironclad morality that refused to bend to the whims of a love-struck nephew. Henry Pole, however, could not afford the luxury of defiance. He was the male head of the family. He was the Baron Montagu. He had estates to manage, tenants to protect, and a son to think of. If he defied the king, he wouldn't just lose his position, he would lose his head, and his lands would be forfeited, leaving his family destitute. So, while his mother scolded the king's agents and defended the princess, Henry Pole went silent. He adopted a strategy of aggressive neutrality. He attended Parliament. He sat in the House of Lords. He bowed to Anne Boleyn when she passed, even as his stomach likely turned. We can only imagine the tension at the dinner tables of the Pole estates during these years. The mother, fierce and vocal in her defense of the old queen, the son, terrified and pleading for caution. "Mother," he might have said, "your courage is noble, but it will kill us all." Henry Pole was walking a path of agonizing compromise. He was trying to be a loyal subject to a king who was dismantling his world. He watched as the Act of Supremacy was passed in 1534, declaring Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England. He watched as his friends, men of principle like Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, refused to take the oath, recognizing this new title. He watched them go to the block. Henry Pole took the oath. He swore that the king was the head of the church. He swore that the marriage to Catherine was invalid. He swore that Anne Boleyn was the true queen. He swallowed his pride. He swallowed his faith. And he signed his name. He chose survival over martyrdom. He must have told himself that he was doing it for his son, for the line, to keep the white rose alive. But the king was not done testing him. There is one moment in Henry Pole's life that deeply illuminates the psychological torture of his position. It is a moment that surely haunted his nightmares until his dying day. It was May 1536. The wheel of fortune had turned with brutal speed. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry VIII had torn Christendom apart, had fallen. She was accused of monstrous crimes, adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother George, and plotting the king's death. It was a purge. It was a show trial designed to free the king for his next wife, Jane Seymour. But the forms of law had to be observed. Anne was a crowned queen. She had to be tried by a jury of her peers. The king's enforcer, Thomas Cromwell, selected 26 noblemen to sit on that jury, and among them he handpicked Henry Pole, Lord Montagu. Consider the layers of irony and pain here. The Poles despised Anne Boleyn. They viewed her as the goggle-eyed whore, the heretic, the woman who had destroyed the true Queen Catherine and bastardized the Princess Mary. In one sense, seeing her fall must have been grimly satisfying. It was what they had prayed for. But to sit in judgment of a queen, to publicly validate the king's terrifying, murderous mood swings? The king was essentially holding a gun to Henry Pole's head. By placing him on the jury, Henry VIII was asking, "Are you willing to help me kill the woman I once loved to prove you are mine? Will you participate in my bloodletting?" If Henry Pole voted not guilty, he would be accusing the king of lying. He would be next on the scaffold. If he voted guilty, he was complicit in judicial murder. On the 15th of May, 1536, in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, Henry Pole sat on the wooden benches. He listened to the flimsy, grotesque evidence, tales of sexual depravity that no one truly believed. He looked at the woman who had been his enemy, now standing pale and terrified, fighting for her life. When the time came, Henry Pole stood up. He placed his hand over his heart, and along with his peers, he uttered the word the king required: guilty. He condemned a woman he hated to serve a king he was beginning to fear. It was an act of supreme moral compromise, born of the desperate instinct to survive. He must have thought, if I do this, if I show him I am his instrument, surely we are safe. Surely this proves I am not a threat. He was wrong. Compliance did not buy safety in the court of Henry VIII. It only bought time. The execution of Anne Boleyn did not bring peace. In late 1536, the north of England exploded. The common people, angry at the dissolution of the monasteries, the new taxes, and the attacks on the old faith, rose up in the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was the largest rebellion Henry VIII ever faced. 30,000 men marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. This was the Tudors' worst nightmare. And who did the rebels look to for leadership? They called for the restoration of the old blood. They called for the removal of low-born counselors like Cromwell and the return of the true nobility to the king's side. Henry Pole did not join the rebellion. He stayed in the south. He kept his head down. But the rebels made a fatal mistake. They mentioned the name Pole with reverence. They viewed the Pole family as the natural leaders of the Catholic opposition. Even though Henry Pole did nothing, the mere fact that the rebels loved him made him a target. In the mind of Henry VIII, a man who is loved by traitors is a traitor himself. The rebellion was crushed with savage cruelty. Hundreds were hanged. And in the aftermath, Thomas Cromwell began to turn his gaze toward the White Rose families. He began to build a dossier. He needed to cut the head off the Hydra. He needed to destroy the alternative royal line. But he needed a pretext. Henry Pole had been too careful. He had taken the oaths. He had served on the jury. He had committed no overt act of treason. So the king and Cromwell looked for a weapon they could use against him. And they found the ultimate weapon. They found it not in England, but in Italy. The downfall of Henry Pole is a masterclass in the unfairness of collective punishment. It wasn't about what Henry did. It was about what his brother did. Henry had a younger brother named Reginald Pole. Reginald was the intellectual of the family, brilliant, scholarly, and deeply pious. Years earlier, the king had generously paid for Reginald's education at the University of Padua, intending for him to return and become a leading light in the English church, perhaps the Archbishop of Canterbury. But Reginald, safe in the sun-drenched libraries of Italy, had watched the king's behavior with growing horror. He could not stomach the divorce. He could not stomach the break with Rome. In 1536, the same year Henry Pole was forcing himself to condemn Anne Boleyn, Reginald Pole decided to speak. He wrote a book. It was titled Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitatis Defensione, in defense of the unity of the church. He sent it directly to Henry VIII. It was not a polite theological disagreement. It was a literary hand grenade. In the book, Reginald unleashed years of pent-up fury. He compared Henry VIII to the Roman Emperor Nero, He called him a tyrant and a slave to his own lusts. He attacked the royal supremacy. And most dangerously of all, he explicitly appealed to the frantic monarchs of Europe, the Emperor Charles V and the King of France, to invade England and depose the heretic king. When the book arrived in England, Henry VIII went incandescent with rage. The king was a man who craved validation. His cousin had sent him a manifesto of hatred. The impact on the Pole family in England was immediate and catastrophic. Henry Pole was horrified. He knew exactly what this meant. Reginald, safe behind the stone walls of papal Rome, had just painted a target on the backs of his mother and brother in England. Henry Pole was forced to write letters to Reginald, dictated by Cromwell, begging him to stop, calling him a traitor, pleading with him to burn the book and return to the king's mercy. "You are unnatural," Henry wrote, likely with a trembling hand. "You will destroy us all." Reginald didn't listen. He felt he was answering to a higher power. He accepted a cardinal's hat from the Pope. He became a prince of the church and an active agent of the anti-Tudor faction in Europe. Back in England, the temperature dropped to freezing. Henry Pole was no longer just the quiet cousin. He was now the brother of the arch-traitor. The king's spies, led by the terrifyingly efficient Cromwell, began to circle the Pole estates. They bribed servants. They intercepted letters. They listened at keyholes. They were waiting for a slip. They were waiting for Henry Pole to say one word that could be twisted into treason. Cromwell knew that Henry Pole was smart. He was cautious. He wouldn't leave a paper trail. If they were going to bring him down, they couldn't attack him directly. They had to break the family from the inside. They needed a weak link, and they found one in the youngest Pole brother, Sir Geoffrey. Geoffrey Pole was not like Henry. He was not stoic. He was not cautious. He was nervous, impressionable, and terrified. In August 1538, Cromwell made his move. He arrested Geoffrey Pole and threw him into the Tower of London. The tragedy of the Pole family was entering its final bloody act. The king had decided that the white rose had bloomed for the last time. He wanted the board cleared, and he was prepared to use the terrorized words of a younger brother to kill the older one. August 1538. The summer heat was stifling within the stone walls of the Tower of London, but for Sir Geoffrey Pole, the air was cold with the promise of death. To destroy Henry Pole, Lord Montagu, a man who had spent a lifetime practicing the art of silence, Thomas Cromwell, needed a voice. He needed a witness who could turn whispers into treason and silence into conspiracy. He found that voice in Henry's younger brother. Geoffrey Pole was the weak link in the Plantagenet chain. He lacked Henry's stoicism and Reginald's fiery conviction. He was a man who enjoyed the comforts of life, a man not built for martyrdom. When the king's guards dragged him to the tower, he did not find courage. He found absolute shattering terror. We do not know the exact specifics of Geoffrey's interrogation. The Tudor state was sophisticated in its cruelty. Often, the instruments of torture, the rack or the scavenger's daughter, did not even need to be used. The mere sight of them, displayed by a grim jailer in a torchlit room, was enough to break a man's spirit. For weeks, Geoffrey held out, but Cromwell was patient. He applied pressure like a vice. He offered Geoffrey a simple, devilish bargain. "Give us your brother, and you will live. Remain silent, and you will die a traitor's death, hanged, drawn, and quartered." Geoffrey broke. In late October, the dam burst. Geoffrey began to talk. He vomited up every conversation, every shared confidence, every grumble he could remember from the last 10 years. He desperately tried to feed the inquisitors enough meat to satisfy their hunger. And what was the grand Exeter conspiracy that Geoffrey revealed? What was the master plan that Henry Pole had allegedly crafted to overthrow the king? It was pathetic. It was agonizingly thin. Geoffrey confessed that Henry had once said, "I dreamed that the king was dead." In the twisted logic of Tudor treason laws, this was fatal. To dream of the king's death was to imagine it, and to imagine the death of the sovereign was high treason. Geoffrey claimed Henry had said, "The world will one day turn upside down," a vague hope for a return to the old religion. He admitted that Henry had received letters from the exiled Reginald and had burned them in his fireplace to hide the evidence. He claimed that Henry Pole had been in close contact with Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter, another Plantagenet cousin, and that they had discussed what would happen if the king died without a male heir. There were no stockpiles of weapons found. There were no muster rolls for secret armies. There were no maps of invasion routes. There was only the bitter private talk of noblemen who hated the changes in their country, but felt powerless to stop them. But for Henry VIII, who was now aging, sick with a festering leg ulcer, and increasingly paranoid, this was enough. The intent was the crime. On November 4th, 1538, the blow fell. It was a coordinated strike. The king's guards arrived at the estates of the White Rose families. Henry Pole, Lord Montagu, was arrested. So was the Marquis of Exeter. So was Henry Pole's wife, Jane. And, in a move that signaled the king's total commitment to erasure, they took Henry's son, the young Henry Pole, and his elderly mother, the Countess of Salisbury. They were all swept into the Tower of London. For Henry Pole, entering the Tower must have felt like a grim homecoming. This was the place where his uncle, the Earl of Warwick, had been murdered. It was the place where his grandfather, the Duke of Clarence, had met his end. The stone walls were practically built from the bones of his ancestors. He was placed in a cell, isolated from his family. The psychological pressure was immense. He was interrogated, likely by Cromwell himself. They confronted him with his brother Geoffrey's confession. Imagine the devastation of that moment, to be told that the evidence that would kill you came from your own blood. Henry Pole, however, did not break. He maintained his dignity. He denied any plot against the king's life. He admitted he didn't like the religious changes. Who could deny that? But he insisted he had remained a loyal subject in his actions. But facts no longer mattered. The verdict had been decided before the arrest. Henry VIII and Cromwell had a problem. The evidence against Henry Pole and the Marquis of Exeter was weak. If they held a public trial, there was a risk. A jury, even a terrified one, might hesitate to condemn the king's own cousin based on the babbling of a broken brother and the evidence of dreams. Furthermore, a public trial would allow Henry Pole to speak. He might defend himself eloquently. He might remind the people of his loyalty on the battlefield. He might garner sympathy. So the king chose a weapon that bypassed justice entirely, the Act of Attainder. An Act of Attainder was a legislative device. It was a bill passed by Parliament that simply declared a person guilty of treason. There was no trial. There was no defense. There was no need to bring witnesses or present proof. Parliament simply voted, and the person was legally dead. It was state-sanctioned murder draped in the robes of law. In early December 1538, the peers of the realm, Henry Pole's former friends, his hunting companions, the men he had sat with in the House of Lords, gathered at Westminster. They were presented with the bill. They knew it was a sham. They knew Henry Pole was not a terrorist, but they also knew that to vote against the king's will was to volunteer to join Pole in the Tower. They voted aye. Henry Pole, Lord Montagu, and Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, were condemned to death. They were stripped of their titles, their lands, and their honors. Their blood was declared corrupt, meaning their children could not inherit. They were erased from the book of the living while they still breathed. January 9th, 1539. It was a cold gray winter morning in London. The gates of the Tower opened and Henry Pole was led out. He was 46 years old. He looked older. The months in the damp cell, the betrayal, and the stress had taken their toll. He was not alone. Beside him walked Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter. These two men represented the last great flowering of the Plantagenet tree. They were the cousins of the king, the grandsons of Edward IV and the Duke of Clarence. They were led to Tower Hill, just outside the fortress walls. A large crowd had gathered. Executions were public spectacles, but this one was somber. The crowd knew these men. They were popular. They were the old nobility, the kind the people understood and respected, unlike the new men like Cromwell. The scaffold was draped in black. The block waited. The accounts of Henry Pole's end are sparse, but they all agree on one thing: his quiet dignity. He did not rage against the dying of the light. He did not scream about his brother's betrayal. He did not curse the king. He understood the script. In Tudor England, if you wanted your family to survive, if you wanted the king to show mercy to your son or your wife, you had to die well. You had to acknowledge that the law had condemned you, even if the law was a lie, and commend your soul to God. Henry Pole climbed the steps. He looked out at the city of London, the city his family had helped rule for centuries. He spoke briefly, commending his spirit to the Almighty and praying for the king. He knelt. He placed his head on the block. The executioner raised the axe. With one swing, the life of Lord Montagu was ended. The quiet one was finally, permanently silenced. As the executioner cleaned the axe on Tower Hill, the immediate political threat to Henry VIII was neutralized. The adult male leader was dead. But for a paranoid king, the work was not done. He looked at the survivors left in the wreckage of the Pole family and saw not grieving relatives but dormant seeds of treason. Inside the tower, 2 prisoners remained, an old woman nearly 70 and a young boy of 12. The tragedy was about to move from political execution to the cold-hearted eradication of a bloodline. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was a woman out of time. She was nearly 70 years old, an ancient age for the Tudor era. She was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty who had been born before the Tudors even took the throne. She carried herself with the stiff, unbreakable pride of a woman who remembered a time when her family ruled the world. For 2 years after her son's execution, the king kept her locked in the tower. It was a petty, vindictive imprisonment. He stripped her of her title. He stripped her of her vast lands. He even stripped her of her dignity. We have records from the tower officials complaining that the old countess had almost no clothing. She suffered in the cold, lacking warm tunics or proper shoes. The king, who had once called her the holiest woman in England, now seemed determined to freeze her to death if he couldn't legally kill her. Margaret, however, refused to break. Throughout her interrogation, she remained defiant. She would not admit to treason. She would not implicate her exiled son, Reginald. When shown a tunic found in her belongings that bore the embroidery of the 5 wounds of Christ, the symbol of the northern rebels, she dismissed it. She told her captors she was a traitor to no man. But in the spring of 1541, a minor rebellion flared up in the north. It had nothing to do with Margaret Pole. She was a frail old woman locked in a cell hundreds of miles away. But it reignited the king's panic. He needed another sacrifice. He needed to clear the board again. On the morning of May 27th, 1541, the lieutenant of the tower entered her cell. He told her to prepare herself. She was to die within the hour. Margaret was reportedly shocked. She had not been put on trial. She had not been sentenced by a judge. Like her son, she was being killed by the act of attainder, the legislative murder. She remarked that no crime had been imputed to her, but she knew protest was futile. What followed is widely considered one of the most gruesome episodes in English history. Because of her royal blood, Margaret was not led out to the public spectacle of Tower Hill. She was to be executed privately on Tower Green, within the walls of the fortress. A small block was set up on the grass. The regular executioner, the professional who had dispatched her son with a single clean blow, was away in the north, busy hanging rebels. In his place stood a substitute. Accounts describe him as a wretched and blundering youth. He was inexperienced, terrified, and incompetent. The details of the execution vary in the telling, but all are horrific. Some reports say the proud countess refused to lay her head on the block, stating, "So should traitors do, and I am none." Others say she was physically dragged to the wood. When the axe came down, it did not strike true. The boy hacked at her. He struck her shoulder. He struck her neck. It was a butchery. It reportedly took 10 or 11 blows to finally sever the head of the last Plantagenet princess. The king had killed a 70-year-old woman in a manner that resembled a slaughterhouse killing. It was an act that shocked the courts of Europe. It was the definitive proof that in the pursuit of his dynasty's safety, Henry VIII had abandoned all chivalry. But if the death of Margaret Pole was a tragedy of violence, the fate of Henry Pole's son was a tragedy of silence. Young Henry Pole is one of the great lost figures of history. When his father was arrested in 1538, the boy was taken to the Tower with him. He was roughly 12 or 13 years old. He had done nothing. He was a child. His only crime was his DNA. He was the great-grandson of the Duke of Clarence. With his father and grandmother dead, and his uncle Reginald in exile as a celibate cardinal, this young boy was the sole heir to the House of York. For Henry VIII, this child was a pretender in the making. As long as the boy lived, he was a rallying point for every disgruntled nobleman in England. But even Henry VIII hesitated to publicly execute a 13-year-old boy. It would have been a step too far, even for a tyrant. It would have turned the stomach of the nation. So the king chose a darker, quieter method. He chose to bury the boy alive. Young Henry was not released after his father's death. He was kept in the Tower. We can trace his existence for a short while through the cold, bureaucratic financial records of the state. There are payments recorded for his diet, food, and clothes. We see entries for a jacket, for hose, for a new shirt. We see that he was kept in the same lodging as the son of the Marquis of Exeter, another child prisoner. They were the king's wards, but in reality they were the king's hostages. Then the records stop. After 1542, the name Henry Pole simply vanishes from the ledger. There is no record of a release. There is no record of a trial. There is no record of a funeral. In the busy, meticulous bureaucracy of the Tudor state, which recorded every penny spent on wax candles and ribbons, the disappearance of a high-ranking royal prisoner is not an accident. It is a policy. What happened to him? Historians have debated this for centuries, but the conclusion is almost certainly grim. The most charitable interpretation is that he died of natural causes, perhaps the plague or tuberculosis, which ran rampant in the damp, unhygienic conditions of the Tower. If he died naturally, the king would have been relieved. But there is a darker possibility. It is entirely possible, and perhaps likely, that he was simply allowed to fade. His rations may have been reduced. His firewood may have been withheld during a harsh winter. Or perhaps, in the dark of night, a pillow was pressed over a sleeping face and a small body was buried under the flagstones of the Tower Chapel next to his father and grandmother. The goal was not just to kill the boy, it was to erase him, to make him a non-person. By denying him a public death, the king denied him the status of a martyr. he simply ceased to be. With the death of this young boy, the direct male line of the Plantagenets, the line that had fought at Agincourt and Crécy, the line of warrior kings was extinguished. The quiet blood had finally been silenced completely. There was one person watching this from afar who felt every blow. Reginald Pole, the cardinal in exile, received the news in pieces. First his brother, then his mother, then the silence of his nephew. Reginald was the man who had lit the fuse with his book, but his family had suffered the explosion. He was safe in Rome, surrounded by art and theology, while his family was butchered in London. He reportedly took the news with a terrible stoic calm, telling his secretary that he was now the son of a martyr. But the guilt must have been crushing. He had stood on his principles, and the cost was the total annihilation of everyone he loved, while the headless bodies of Henry Pole and the Countess of Salisbury were decomposing in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. One member of the family was still breathing the air of freedom. But for Sir Geoffrey Pole, freedom was a torture chamber more agonizing than any dungeon in the Tower. Geoffrey was the survivor. He was the man who had cracked. He was the brother who had sold his kin for a pardon. After his release in late 1538, Geoffrey tried to return to his life in Sussex, but the mark of Cain was upon him. In the insular, honor-bound world of the English aristocracy, he was a pariah. His own wife, Constance, found his presence unbearable. His neighbors, who had looked up to the Lord Montagu as a pillar of rectitude, looked at Geoffrey and saw a monster. But the harshest judge was Geoffrey himself. Historical records give us glimpses of a man disintegrating under the weight of his conscience. He was consumed by a manic, restless energy. He couldn't sleep. He saw the face of his brother Henry in the shadows of his manor house. He heard the voice of his mother in the wind. In a fit of despair, he reportedly tried to suffocate himself with a pillow, unable to live with the knowledge that his breath was bought with their blood. When that failed, he assaulted his own flesh. He was a man possessed by the furies of guilt. Finally, in 1548, a year after the tyrant Henry VIII finally died, Geoffrey could take it no longer. He abandoned his wife and children. He fled to the coast, boarded a ship, and sailed for Rome. He went to find the only person who might understand, or perhaps the person who would punish him most severely, his brother Reginald. The meeting between the two brothers in Rome is one of the most poignant scenes in the family saga. Geoffrey, the broken traitor, threw himself at the feet of Reginald, the prince of the church. He confessed his sins. He begged for forgiveness. And Reginald Pole, who had lost his mother and brother because of Geoffrey's weakness, did not strike him. He raised him up. He embraced him. He arranged for Geoffrey to be absolved by the Pope himself. It was an act of supreme Christian charity, but it could not fix Geoffrey's mind. Geoffrey spent the rest of his life as a hanger-on in his brother's household, a ghost of a man, forever looking over his shoulder. Back in England, the great wheel of fortune made its most dramatic turn yet. In 1553, the young Protestant King Edward VI, the boy for whom Henry VIII had killed the Poles to protect, died at the age of 15. The Tudor line was thinning. Against all odds, the crown passed to Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. This was the moment the Pole family had died for. Mary was the woman Henry Pole's mother had raised. She was the woman the Poles had supported during the divorce. She was a fervent Catholic, and she viewed the Pole family not as traitors, but as martyrs who had bled for her cause. For Reginald Pole, this was the signal. The long winter was over. In 1554, he returned to England, not as a fugitive, but as a savior. He sailed up the Thames, the papal legate, coming to restore England to the Church of Rome. The irony was staggering. Only 16 years earlier, his brother Henry had been beheaded for communicating with him. Now Reginald was the second most powerful man in the kingdom, the chief advisor to the Queen, and soon to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. But history is rarely a fairy tale. The restoration of the Pole family was bathed in a melancholic twilight glow. Reginald Pole was no longer the dashing young scholar. He was an old man, weary and sick. Queen Mary was also aging, desperate for a child she would never have, and increasingly bitter. Together they tried to turn back the clock. They tried to rebuild the monasteries Henry VIII had destroyed. They tried to restore the old rituals, but they were trying to build on a graveyard. Reginald, now Archbishop, found himself in a position eerily similar to the one his brother had feared. To secure the Catholic restoration, the regime turned to persecution. The Marian burnings began. Protestants were burned at the stake for heresy. Reginald, the humanist who had once preached moderation, became the face of a new terror. He was driven by a desperate need to make his family's sacrifice mean something. He wanted to build an England that justified the death of his brother Henry and his mother Margaret. If he could restore the true faith, then perhaps their deaths were not in vain. They were the seed of the church. But the people of England did not see it that way. They saw a foreign prelate burning English men and women. The name Pole, once beloved by the rebels of the North, became feared. The tragedy of the Poles is that they were always on the wrong side of time. They were medieval figures in a modern world. They were Catholics in a country rapidly becoming Protestant. They were Yorkists in a Tudor age. The end came in November 1558. Queen Mary, broken by a phantom pregnancy and a broken heart, lay dying at St. James's Palace. Across the river at Lambeth Palace, Reginald Pole was also on his deathbed, struck down by influenza. The bond between the Queen and her cousin, the daughter of Aragon and the son of Clarence, held to the very end. They died within hours of each other on the same day, November 17th, 1558. With their deaths, the Catholic restoration collapsed instantly. Elizabeth I ascended the throne. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry Pole had condemned to death. The Boleyn faction had won the final round. So, what is the legacy of Henry Pole, Lord Montagu? He is buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower, lying near the headless bodies of Queens Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and the ambitious Thomas Cromwell. It is a crowded room of enemies who found peace only in the grave. Henry Pole represents the road not taken of English history. He represents the conservative, feudal Catholic England that was swept away by the hurricane of the Reformation. He was a man of the old world, trying to survive in the new. His life teaches us about the terrible crushing weight of the state. He did everything asked of him. He compromised. He obeyed. He stayed silent. But the state crushed him anyway because his very existence was a question mark over the legitimacy of the regime. If you walk through the ruins of the great English abbeys today, or stand on the execution spot at Tower Hill, you are standing in the wreckage of Henry Pole's world. He was the man who stood still, and for that he was destroyed. History remembers the monsters. It remembers Henry VIII, but it is the quiet victims like Henry Pole who reveal the true cost of that glory. He was the sacrificial lamb on the altar of the Tudor dynasty, a man whose blood was too royal to be allowed to flow in living veins. The story of the Plantagenets ends not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a government that decided one family was simply too dangerous to exist. And so the white rose withered, not in the frost of winter, but in the heat of a king's ambition.